Hi there, welcome to Live and Local, PATV's long-running show which focuses on the people and organizations that are making Iowa City such a wonderful place to live and that are making a difference here in Iowa City. It's my pleasure to welcome to the show this evening three gentlemen from GRASP, which is the Global and Regional Asperger's Syndrome Partnership from the Southeast Iowa chapter. This evening joining me are Tyler Sandersfeld, Ron Wright, and Brian Bennett. Gentlemen, welcome to the show and Happy New Year. This is the first Live and Local of 2012. It's really nice to have you here.
Thanks for having us.
So your organization, it's GRASP. It deals with helping people with Asperger's syndrome. But before we start talking specifically about what GRASP does, tell the folks at home, what is precisely Asperger's? How is it diagnosed? I know there's a scale of it, there's varying degrees. Tell us what Asperger's syndrome is, who has it, and what kind of challenges those people are faced with this diagnosis.
Well, I'll start. I'm now 53 years old, and I found GRASP in April of 2011 after a lifetime search of just something was always wrong in life, just not quite right. I made people mad a lot. I didn't know why. I like to go off and be by myself, and I didn't know why. I wasn't a real social animal. Didn't know why, and went through a series of psychiatrists and that, and just still wasn't getting the answers. And it was finally on the internet. I just happened to be doing, I happened to be reading a book one time, and it talked about Asperger's syndrome, told me what it was. And it was like it was describing me, and I started doing some searches, and that's when I reached out and I found the grasp.org, drilled down, then I found the Southeast Iowa GRASP chapter. Went to my first meeting and the facilitator looked at me. I was just slightly late, and she said, "You're new here, what's your story?" And I didn't know if I was in the right place, and I spoke for 5 minutes and I saw all these heads nodding, yep, yep. And I knew finally I had my own diagnosis.
So that was your experience about finding this group, but what are things that are commonly associated across the spectrum of people who do in fact have Asperger's syndrome?
Well, I suppose the most common attribute with Asperger's syndrome, and indeed the entire autism spectrum, is basically an inability to socialize. It's on a basic scale, it's the inability to socialize. Asperger's syndrome people tend not to have the broader communication difficulties that people with straight up autism, as you might call it, are more likely to have. For example, Ron, Brian, and I are quite capable of holding a conversation if we want to.
I
usually don't want to.
Television shows here at PTV.
Yeah, so I guess one way to differentiate autism and Asperger's syndrome is that autism is somewhat more noticeable than Asperger's, but once you know what Asperger's syndrome is, it should be more apparent to those outside the spectrum who might have Asperger's syndrome.
Well, Brian, you had mentioned that you came upon your diagnosis through research a little bit later in life.
Mm-hmm.
How young are people generally when this syndrome can be noticed and detected? Is it something that's normally found in younger people, older people, late onset, early onset? Where do people discover that they in fact have Asperger's?
Generally, I think younger people are more likely to get a diagnosis, especially these days. I was 10 years old when I was diagnosed, and that was back in 1993, approximately when the DSM-4 came out, and that's when Asperger's syndrome was first classified as an actual diagnosis.
I'd like to add something else to the what Brian and Tyler have already related, and that is, it's not always a social anxiety that is prevalent in people with autism and Asperger's syndrome. For instance, I have a bright yellow lime green jacket that I wear when I'm bicycling, and it's nice. It keeps me warm, and I like wearing it. I'm glad I bought it. However, if I wore it to a situation such as a dinner engagement, I would be standing out like a huge exclamation point. So sometimes it's manifested as an inability to recognize what's appropriate behavior and what is appropriate to wear in a given situation. Mm-hmm. So it's these miscues, can be conversational. It can also be, where do I stand in the order of the business? Mm-hmm. Who talks first when you're giving a conversation, trying to be not, if someone is impolite and don't really recognize that they're being impolite, that's another way of manifesting autism and Asperger's syndrome.
And a lot of the social anxiety can stem from that knowledge that you might not know what the proper social cues and social actions are. This is coming from personal experience. When I was a kid, before I was officially diagnosed, I was like, why are all these people thinking I'm such a freak and a weirdo mm-hmm. and to get a little darker, a psycho? Mm-hmm. Once I got the diagnosis, it turned from why are these people making fun of me to how can I stop these people from making fun of me, and it just got even more anxious from there.
Mm-hmm. Well, once that diagnosis is made, what in your case when you're a younger man, mm-hmm. or with Brian much more recently, does that then change how you can adjust those things? Like when you're aware of it, Ron, would you now say, mm-hmm. well, let me think about this wonderful lime green and yellow jacket for a second? Do you become more tuned into those things before you might experience them? Or does that just help you understand why perhaps these social miscues, as I think you said, were occurring?
Well, I think it's a matter of, just remembering them and incorporating them in what you do, because I can see it happening where I've gone to situations that I've never been in before, like a social gathering, and I can hang out by the door. So if I have a bad experience with that, I may not understand what's going on or why it didn't turn out well for me. And so from then on, I never go to any social gathering. Mm-hmm. So it's not always, it has to be able, the person has to be able to intellectualize what's going on, and understand the situation. I think that's a great, I don't want to say detriment, but a great absence is being able to understand context, that what I did was inappropriate and that's why people laughed at me or something like that. Not being able to know what is going on and what is inappropriate behavior is what keeps people from engaging in social situations in the first place. So a lot of times people with autism, Asperger's syndrome just they're not even seen outside of where they have to go on a daily or weekly basis.
Yeah, in my case, I worked with a person recently, a psychotherapist. He called it getting in the balcony. Once I got some validation that's really something. You guys were the first to validate it, the group. What I described he called being up in the balcony. I'm able to take a moment when I enter a situation, virtually go up in the balcony and scout it out and go, what would be the right thing to do here? Versus just to let your instinct go forward, because my instinct won't carry me very far in a lot of the situations.
So it seems like there's a uniform experience of sometimes not knowing what to do or mm-hmm. being awkward or off-put, mm-hmm. but I'm sure that based on every individual that probably manifests itself in very different ways. Like you said, Ron said some people just wouldn't engage at all, some people mm-hmm. would, or stand by the door. How, once you're diagnosed, what tools, tricks, treatments are there to help, as you all hear now, talking with me on a TV show, to get people who might have previously had some maybe reservations to go through that, because clearly, and we'll start talking about GRASP in a bit here, but clearly just diagnosis and treatment of these things is helpful to people to overcome those. How are those reservations or social anxieties addressed so that you can then go forward, and even once you scout it out in the balcony, then you can go down in the main floor, so to speak, and enjoy the crowd.
I always just take my time anymore. I've become much more patient and much more deliberate. And I honestly go through my head and I think through what would be the right thing to say. I'm married to my spouse, to my children if I have to discipline. I pause, literally pause, is about the best trick I've come up with.
And is this something that you came up with just through experience, or was this like something that's maybe taught to a lot of people?
It started happening once somebody validated that, yeah, you have something. Because up until the time you're validated, and I didn't get a formal diagnosis like you,
Right.
I always just knew something wasn't right, but I didn't know what it was. So that was the defining moment for me to whenever I go into these situations, just say, remember, now pause, and mentally, remember you have Asperger's, so you might want to think through these things. So it's just a learned habit now.
So that was kind of your individual journeys to get to this point. But let's now talk about the organization that you're all a part of, which has brought you here, which I mentioned earlier is GRASP. Tell the folks at home what GRASP is, what it's about, how it helps people with Asperger's, with autism, and how you guys are specifically and individually involved in it.
Well, first and foremost, GRASP is actually pretty much strictly for adults on the autism spectrum. Every now and then we will allow children to come, but really we're about helping adults on the spectrum, since one of the main reasons is that a lot of the support for Asperger's syndrome these days is directed towards children. There's very little support out there for adults on the autism spectrum, which is why one of the reasons why Michael John Carley founded the original GRASP group.
Right. He's written a book. It's called Asperger's Syndrome from the Inside Out, and that's comes from his experience growing up as a youngster, not knowing what his issues were, why he couldn't relate to people, and it wasn't until he was 36 years old that he found out he has Asperger's syndrome, because he took his 3-year-old son to be diagnosed, and that's when he started learning about Asperger's syndrome and decided that there was a need for this group because there is no support for adults with Asperger's syndrome. It's primarily geared towards parents of children with Asperger's syndrome and autism, and that's why it started, because in order to be a member of GRASP, you have to be an adult. I think in my mind, there's kind of a question mark about what happens to a child once they become 18, a child with autism, because most of the support that's out there is for children, and there is no real, until GRASP, there was no real addressing what happens once a person becomes an adult and still has autism.
What is the support that's offered to children? Clearly, the support will change for a 10-year-old child versus a 50-year-old man. But what is that support that's offered to children that are diagnosed early? And then, if GRASP didn't exist or before it exists, how are people who are getting support facing the challenges that they would after that support just was cut off because it was, in fact, geared just towards children?
Well, I know in my case, I pretty much just bumbled through life because there was no safety net for me. I didn't know what it was. I just knew I could hold a job. I would never rise in the job. I never knew why. I would never get very far, up in the food chain, to speak. So with me, it just knowing these things, helped bring all that home.
I do know that there are plenty of psychiatrists and psychologists who specialize on autism spectrum disorders for children, but very few I know of that specialize for adults or all ages, really. Like when I was a kid, I was put on a lot of medications, none of which worked. And I also had an aide through high school who would help me realize when I'm not behaving correctly socially, and she would also administer private lessons based around socializing better.
In my case, that seemed to be a common thread when I approached the group, was we would be over-medicated if we weren't diagnosed correctly. Well, you're just nervous, you've got depression, whatever, something along those lines. And I got to the point where I was meted so much I couldn't stay awake in the afternoons. I was a lot calmer because I was literally almost asleep. So that's not the way it needed to happen for me. I needed first validation with the group, some place to let, be myself.
Well, to answer your question, I really don't know what sort of support there is out there for children. I mean, not the entire extent, but I do know that they have, the schools will develop an IEP with the parents and teachers in order to have appropriate schooling for the child. And there are more colleges now that are addressing students who have Asperger's syndrome. They're making groups and classes for them. But beyond that, I don't know specifically what happens to a child or to the family that is trying to find placement for their child or find ways of keeping their child in their family, since they oftentimes aren't able to function outside the home on their own.
What then are the specific challenges and obstacles that groups like GRASP help adults who have Asperger's to face? How are the challenges of having Asperger's different as a 25-year-old, say, different than a 10 or 12 years old? And then how is GRASP programs like that specifically geared to help people?
Well, every month we have a formal meeting, which is the second Saturday, and through those formal meetings, the main discussion point is usually around a certain issue that adults with Asperger's face. One of the recent events we've been doing on the formal Saturdays is we've had a pair of improv teachers stop by and teach us about improvisation, which is very helpful when communicating, I've learned.
Seemed odd at first, but the idea behind the improvisation was it's not unlike us walking into a social situation, and it's really improv for all of us. Mm-hmm. But we would deliver the wrong line, and what improv taught us was to listen, think, then deliver your next. Yeah, not too much, and then come back with your response.
Besides those specific programs that you have, it seems GRASP, which is a national organization, you guys are the Southeast Iowa chapter, what overarching mission, so to speak, do they have in offering services, support, help, networking? What, for an organization like GRASP, if you were to explain to somebody just in 2 minutes in an elevator, like, hey, let me tell you about this great group I found, GRASP, what is GRASP in a nutshell, so to speak?
Well, it is primarily a networking organization. Mm-hmm. They have a website that's www.grasp.org, and on that there are 25 support groups in the country. So there's not a great deal, and there's also 2 support groups in Canada. There's also a forum, an online forum that people can post, their messages, their questions, and have someone in the community or someone from GRASP answer those questions. We count on placing our brochures that we've developed in offices offices of psychiatry or of the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics, so that people who are diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome or autism can have a place to, they know about our group, and hopefully they have other referrals that are available to them in those offices, not just ours, of course.
In my case, I think the networking is the thing they do first and foremost. And what I do is I actually subscribe to a lot of the forum, the email forums, and I've sort of taken a reverse psychology towards it. I subscribe to the one called NT Partners with Asperger spouses. NT is neurotypical. It's a non-Asperger's. It might be the opposite of us, per se. And it's spouses that say, here's why I'm having a difficulty working with my Asperger spouse. What it's done for me is I go, oh, that's what I come off like? Just opened my eyes to a lot of things.
What, as adults, are challenges that might present themselves being at, whether, as you mentioned, in a marriage, having jobs? What are the things that an NT person might not face, but then just, life's, for us, quite frustrating enough oftentimes, dealing with this little problem, that bigger issues. How are those things different, maybe faced by someone who has Asperger's?
Well, just getting a job seems to be much more difficult for people on the adults on the Asperger's syndrome to begin with. I frequently read a site called Jobs for Autism, which is about stories and support for people who are adults looking for jobs, because just the job application is highly social itself, and with Asperger's syndrome and autism somewhat inhibiting your abilities to socialize properly, it can be very difficult to really nail the interview or know what to put on your resume, stuff like that.
My case with a spouse, choice of clothing is a big deal. I just don't, colors and matches and stuff, and my wife will ask me, you're not wearing that, are you? And it doesn't occur to me that that's wrong. I'm most comfortable in a t-shirt all the time, and I would just do that all the time if I could. And my spouse always complains I'm just not huggable, and that's just not something that's intuitive to me.
Well, and with me, you can see obviously I have notes on my lap here. This is what I do that helps me be able to be conversational. I have ideas, and I may get so caught up in them that I can't focus them enough to come across coherently. So writing down my ideas and feelings, frustrations helps me sort out what's going on with me, and then I can bring forward what I want to present in a way that lets me be understood and lets other people see what I'm about.
Are there misconceptions that people who don't know a lot about autism or Asperger's might have about people who suffer, be it in romantic relationships, be it in the employment market? Are there people that, when they find out, are like, oh, well, that explains a lot? Or are there people that are like, ooh, what's Asperger's? Because there are people who don't know a lot about it. What's your feeling out in the world, so to speak? Either letting people know that you have Asperger's, autism, or that they find out. What's that like?
Well, I think one of the biggest misconceptions about autism and Asperger's syndrome is that those diagnosed on the spectrum are incapable of having romantic relationships, which Brian obviously
Disproved?
Yeah, disproved. I'm a bachelor and I like it like that, so I'm sort of strengthening the stereotype, unfortunately, but yeah, there was a lot of people in the group are in romantic relationships, so that's definitely a misconception. And another misconception is that we don't have very much of a sense of humor. I think anyone who's talked to me for 4 seconds can realize that that's a bunch of bunk. We might have a different sense of humor sometimes, but that's just not true.
John Michael Carley did a good speech about a year ago, and one of the myths he brought up was that we're all good at math. And we all had a good chuckle that. I find that a lot of us are, but that there's, just like it's a spectrum, some are on the different end, and math just isn't our thing. In my case, it's just so easy. I can just visualize it in my mind.
And I got a degree in mathematics, so once again, strengthening the stereotypes.
What? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ron.
Well, I was going to say, I have this book by Ralph James Savarese, Reasonable People, and it's about his and his wife's adoption of a 5-year-old boy when they lived in Florida who has autism. He's intelligent, but he's completely nonverbal. And even now that he's 18, 19 years old, he still does not use language like we do. And so that's a misconception that if people don't communicate like we do, they're dumb or they're not one of us. And he is one of us. He's a person and deserves to be treated like that. It takes a little more effort to understand and communicate with him than it does somebody who's verbal. And so I wish the burden could be shifted upon the people who wish to communicate rather than those who are enduring autism, that there's more than one way to communicate. And let's take a little more time, because people who have autism, they are communicating.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
How is it that people can better reach out to and learn about that kind of communication, or help facilitate that if in fact there's people in their family or children? What can they do to help strengthen their ability to communicate with people who are communicating in a way different than their own? What's the universal language, so to speak, if there is one, or how to best bridge that gap?
I think that the universal language is slow down and listen. And that goes for both sides, both the neurotypicals and the autism spectrum side. Just, we tend to speak really fast when we think that the other person is going to understand completely what we're going to say, and oftentimes that's not the case. So just take your time, pause, as Brian brought up, and we all speak English. We might speak different mind waves, but if we just take the time, we can understand each other pretty well.
I'm certain that the diagnosis of Asperger's and autism has changed over time, but with the advent of different treatment or support strategies, with the advent of groups like GRASP, how has the relationship of people with autism or Asperger's changed in the greater community in the last, say, 15, 20, 25 years? Was there a time when perhaps they weren't able to, as you are out in the workforce and these things, but have we now become, I won't say more accepting, because we should accept all stripes of life, but more accommodating and more better at communicating, even to bring these people into just more parts of day-to-day life?
Well, just on the whole broad world spectrum, there's been a huge increase in autism advocacy, groups, like I said, like Autism Speaks has become prominent in the last few years, although a lot of people on the autism spectrum don't really care for Autism Speaks for multiple reasons. And there's Comedy Central has been doing that Night of Too Many Stars fundraising event. So when I was diagnosed in 1993, it was like autism and Asperger's syndrome was still relatively unknown, actually really unknown. Now it's pretty much a household word.
It's awareness that helps, I think. However you can get the message out like this. Before, I think, what we'd have is we would just call people kooky or weird or aloof, and they would just get kind of shoved to the back of the line and in life and so on and so forth. So, in my mind, awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And for the people that are watching this at home or will be watching this online, here in Southeast Iowa, here in Iowa City, tell them again, Ron, you had mentioned the website for GRASP, if they're interested in learning more about these things, if they have family members or perhaps they themselves have Asperger's or autism, how can they find out about you guys and the good work that you're doing?
Well, the GRASP website is www.grasp.org. We have developed our own brochure, and hopefully we'll have a PDF for you that you can show the information. A contact person on that is me and also Judy Thayer. So if people want to call, they can call Judy or send me an email, and we'll tell them about our group, where it meets.
And anyone on the spectrum is just welcome to stop in any time. We meet every second and fourth Saturday upstairs at Uptown Bells.
Well, listen, gentlemen, I want to thank you all so much for coming out, speaking with us today. I certainly learned a lot about these things. I'm sure everybody at home did as well. And I appreciate the good work that GRASP is doing here in the community. So thanks again for talking with us.
Thanks
You're
for
welcome,
having
and thank
us.
you very
Thank you,
much
Yale.
for having us.